Hi, I'm Mike Ebert, and we're talking today with Mike Licona, who is a New Testament historian with the North American Mission Board. And Mike, we've been talking about evidences for Jesus' resurrection. You're a historian. Tell us a little bit about what historians, how they conduct their work, and what we should expect from the data.
Well, most historians, we're going to act like detectives in some sense, where a detective would go on a crime scene, they're going to look at, survey it, they're going to look at all this data, and they're going to form hypotheses. And based on some of the data that's going to be relevant, some that isn't. And you're going to form these different hypotheses of what occurred, and the hypothesis that can best account for the data is considered what probably occurred. So there is no kind of absolute certainty in this, it's probable.
Now, is there a certain process or a method that an historian would use when approaching this work?
Yeah, in fact, there are 4 general criteria that historians will use in order to assess a hypothesis, to see if it's the best explanation. And it's called arguments to the best explanation and inference to the best explanation. One of those criteria would be explanatory scope. And that would be, can the hypothesis account adequately for all of the data, all of the relevant data? So imagine a jigsaw puzzle, and you've got the puzzle pieces. You want to use all those pieces. You don't want to leave any stranded. And so the solution that can include the most amount of puzzle pieces is to be preferred. It's the same thing within historical investigation. You want to be able to use the most amount, all of the relevant historical data. That would excel in explanatory scope. Another criterion is explanatory power, and that is the ability to account for the relevant data without forcing it to fit. So back to the jigsaw puzzle, imagine taking the piece, a puzzle piece, and you know how you can force it to fit in there, given its shape, but you know it doesn't really go there. Well, sometimes historians do that with the historical facts or data. They try to force it into their hypothesis when it really doesn't go that well. Or it could be that you're putting it within the hypothesis. The hypothesis is including it, but you're making your hypothesis in such a way as it's very ambiguous or vague. So it would lack explanatory power. A third criterion would be plausibility, and that would be, does your hypothesis line up with other facts that are widely accepted? And finally, less ad hoc. Ad hoc is a Latin term that refers to non-evidenced assumptions. In other words, do you really have to improv in order to make this hypothesis work? So let me just give you an example. It's kind of like what doctors do, what physicians do. So let's say you've got a 15-year-old robust male who comes into the office and says, Doc, I've been vomiting, I've got a fever, I've got abdominal pains in my lower right abdomen. Well, the doctor would take those 3 symptoms, the physician, and say, okay, well, what do we have here? Well, is it the flu? Well, the flu adequately accounts for the fever, but not the vomiting or the abdominal pain on the right-hand side. So that would lack explanatory scope. You say, well, maybe this is just one of those rare cases where it would include those. Well, it's possible, but it would lack explanatory power because it's almost like you're forcing that to fit in order to get your diagnosis of the flu. And because if you look throughout the medical literature and there were no other known cases of someone having the flu with those 3 symptoms, then it would lack plausibility. Well, suppose you say, well, okay, maybe this is what happened. The guy was a martial artist, he has the flu. He went to martial arts practice that night and he got kicked in the lower right abdomen. And then after practice, he went out and ate and got food poisoning, and that's why he was vomiting. Well, now that would adequately account for all the facts. It would do it without pushing them to fit. It would be plausible, but it's completely ad hoc because of these non-evidenced assumptions of whether the guy was a martial artist who went out to eat afterward. You're improving, so it would be ad hoc. What you want is a hypothesis that can pass all 4 of these criteria very well.
That's great. Now, if my theory about Jesus' resurrection is that it was a fraud, it was a hoax, you know, his disciples pulled him out of the tomb and hid the body or did something else with it and then started telling this story, take that method that you just explained, how would you then approach it to start fitting those puzzle pieces around?
Good question. The fraud theory that say the disciples, like you said, stole the body, lied about the appearances. That would have been something maybe around 100 years ago, maybe more. Hardly anyone accepts it today. I don't know of anyone, any scholars that is, who would accept it. For good reason. It doesn't account for one of the facts we discussed that's accepted by almost everyone, and that is that shortly after Jesus' death by crucifixion, a number of people, friend and foe alike, had experiences in both individual and in group settings that convinced them that it was the risen Jesus who had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. And that fact is so strongly evidenced that it militates very heavily against fraud. So that would be, it wouldn't be able to account for that fact.
That's a puzzle piece that just doesn't fit, or would have to be force fit somehow.
That, and yeah, wouldn't account for Paul. We wouldn't expect him to lie about these things or fall for something like that, since he's an enemy of the church.
All right, well, let's take another hypothesis out there, a theory that maybe Jesus didn't really die. And so, you know, that accounts for this story, why, you know, the apostles saw him, or the disciples saw him afterwards. How would you apply the method to that?
Yeah, that's another one of those that hasn't been accepted really for over 100 years, the apparent death theory, and for really good reason. First of all, the evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion is astonishing, and in fact so much so that people like Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic, Gert Ludemann, an atheist, John Dominic Crossan, a liberal, have said that Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the surest things of history that we can know. So, you know, we've got both Christian and non-Christian sources who report it. From what we know of crucifixion, the chances of surviving were very bleak. I did a study on crucifixion a year before The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson came out. I studied it for about 6 months, looking at every single ancient source I could find on crucifixion. It was a very sobering and disturbing study. In fact, there were several times I just had to close the books and walk away. It was so disturbing. And people in antiquity, the writers didn't like to write about it often because it was so horrific a way of dying. Usually the person was brought out. They were tortured before being crucified. In the case of Jesus and many throughout the Roman Empire, there was the scourging where pretty much they were filleted alive, bringing them close to the point of death. And then they put them up on the cross. On the cross, you were usually nailed to the cross, which would be very painful. And you would die usually of asphyxiation because you couldn't breathe. You had too much carbon dioxide in you as well. So that's why they broke the legs, because what would happen is in the downstretch position, it was very difficult to exhale. And so you'd have to pull up on those nails and push up on the ones on your feet, which would cause the nail to tear through the flesh, which of course would be excruciating. And in fact, the term excruciating comes from the Latin out of the cross. So you wouldn't want to do it, but you'd have to get rid of that carbon dioxide. And so you would push up, you'd exhale, and then take a breath and go down, and there'd be very shallow breathing until you had to get rid of that carbon dioxide, and then you'd push up again. That, of course, is why they would break the legs in Jerusalem. Now, outside of Jerusalem, you could be on a cross for days, even as much as a week. So it was a very brutal death. But Josephus reports that in Jerusalem, prior to the destruction of the temple in the year 70, that people were removed from their crosses the day of their execution, which means they had to die that day. So it becomes very plausible that you would break the legs. So you could see the chances of surviving crucifixion very, very small. We only have one account of a man surviving crucifixion in antiquity. Josephus reports that 3 of his friends were crucified. He saw them. He ran to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, begged for their lives, and he granted it. And so they prematurely moved all 3 of them and provided the best medical care Rome had to offer. But in spite of this, 2 of the 3 died. Now, in the case of Jesus, you probably have more severe scourging that day because he's going to have to die that day. There's no accounts of Jesus being removed prematurely or being provided any medical assistance whatsoever. So historians have to go by probability, and given the very strong evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion, unless someone can provide equally compelling evidence to the contrary, the historian, at least, must conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. So the apparent death theory just doesn't work. And if that wasn't enough, then you have the problem of how you convince the disciples that he had been raised and appeared to them. Because think about it, Jesus is half dead. He comes out of the tomb. I mean, how does he get out of the tomb anyway? You know, he's afraid of the dark, so he wakes up and says, I don't like the dark. And he puts his hand instead of been pierced by nails and presses the stone out of the way. And then if Matthew's correct about the guard, then he sees the guards and they say, well, where do you think you're going? He says, I'm out of here, guys. And so he beats them up. And then he walks blocks in order to find his disciples and then knocks on the door. And they see him hunched over in his pathetic and mutilated state. Now, are they going to say, wow, I can't wait to have a resurrection body just like yours? Or are they going to say, where's Luke the physician? You know, you need a doctor. So you're not going to convince them that he's the risen Prince of Life. Alive, yes, but resurrected in an immortal body, not a chance.